Okay. Philosophy of time. Sorry, philosophy of waiting. So, Claude, I'd like to have a debate with you about the philosophy of waiting. Is waiting an active or passive state? Is there a difference between waiting for something and wasting time? Let's see what it says. It's producing an output and copying. And I'm going to be explanatory next. Okay, here's what it had to say.
This is a fascinating philosophical territory to explore. I'd argue that waiting exists on a spectrum from deeply passive to remarkably active, and that the distinction between waiting and wasting time often hinges on intentionality and awareness. Consider the phenomenology of waiting itself. When you're waiting for a delayed train, there's often an acute consciousness of time's passage. You're mentally engaged with duration, anticipation, and possibility. This seems far from passive. The waiting person is actively maintaining attention toward the future event, processing uncertainty, and often making micro decisions about how to use the interim moments. There's a kind of temporal vigilance at work. But then we have what we might call empty waiting, mindless scrolling while waiting, or the numbed patience of bureaucratic queues. Here waiting approaches pure passivity, where consciousness itself seems suspended. As for waiting versus wasting time, I think the key difference lies in whether the waiting serves a larger purpose or meaning structure in your life. Waiting for medical test results involves the same temporal suspension as waiting for a trivial phone call, but one is embedded in meaningful life concerns while the other might feel hollow. Here's where I'd push back on a common assumption though. I don't think productive waiting is necessarily superior to unproductive waiting. Sometimes the open, receptive state of pure waiting, what we might call contemplative waiting, has its own value. What's your take? Do you see waiting as fundamentally about our relationship to time and control?
Damn it, what is that? How do I bring up? There we go. I think there's a lot going on there. Personally, I wanted to address this last point about productive versus unproductive waiting. And I think that also connects to the idea of wasting time. The thing about time is that it is a irrecoverable commodity. Every human being, whether they want to believe it or not, is slowly depleting the time that they have, to be alive. The interesting thing is none of us knows what our end point is, i.e., the time at which our death will occur. But the truth is that the passage of time is bringing us all closer and closer to what that inevitable moment and endpoint is going to be. So between now and when that particular moment occurs is essentially the time that you have. And so how do you want to use that time? Because you'll never get back the time that you spend. Never, right? There is no such thing as going back in time. So I think it depends on so that's one thing, right? So what is given time is an irrecoverable commodity. Is there now an incumbent to make the most of it? And what does making the most of it actually mean? So when you are quote unquote unproductively waiting, does that count as wasting time because you're not doing anything anything that has any importance to you while you're doing that. So I would question that. I would say that quote unquote productive waiting is superior because you are doing something quote unquote productive with the time that you have that you will never ever get back. So I'm interested to hear your perspective on that. Okay, transferring over, and now I'm going to input it. Okay. Now I have it, and now I'm going to hear what Claude has to say.
You've articulated something profound about the existential weight of time. This irreversible, finite resource we're all spending moment by moment without knowing our remaining balance. Your framing forces us to confront a fundamental question. If time truly is irrecoverable, does this create a moral imperative to maximize its use? Let me walk through why I think this creates a more complex picture than it might initially appear. First, let's examine what productive actually means in this context. When you suggest that productive waiting is superior because you're doing something productive with the time you have, we need to ask, productive toward what end? If I'm reading a
Agreed.
work email while waiting for the dentist, that might seem productive in an economic sense. But if I'm using that same waiting time to simply observe my own breathing and let my mind settle, that might be productive toward my mental health, my capacity for presence, or my ability to handle the dental procedure with less anxiety. Here's where I think the analysis becomes more nuanced. The very awareness of time's finite nature that you're describing might actually argue asterisk for asterisk some forms of seemingly unproductive waiting. Consider that our culture's obsession with constant productivity often stems from anxiety about mortality. We fill every moment because we fear the confrontation with finitude that stillness brings. But what if that confrontation is exactly what gives weight and meaning to our other activities? Think about it this way. A musician doesn't just play notes continuously. The rests, the pauses, the spaces between notes are what give music its shape and meaning. Similarly, might there be something essential about allowing ourselves periods of genuine non-doing that actually enhances the quality of our active moments? There's also a deeper philosophical question here about what constitutes a life well lived. If we accept that time is finite and irreversible, does this necessarily mean that cramming maximum activity into each moment produces the richest existence? Or might there be wisdom in recognizing that some of our most profound experiences, falling in love, grieving loss, having creative insights, often emerge precisely in those moments when we're not trying to be productive? What do you think about this tension? Does the finite nature of time demand constant optimization, or might it actually call for a more varied rhythm that includes both intense engagement and receptive stillness?
I love these points that you raised. So there's a lot here that I kind of want to get into. I agree with you about the point that you said about let's examine what productive actually means. So productive to what end? I think that's a fair point to make. And I do believe that you're right in the sense that the common expectation is to be productive all the time. I definitely suffer from that. And I agree that there is a over index in that direction, which actually might be counterproductive to what the actual goal is. Um, I think that the point about music is a good analogy. Yes, there isn't just constant music playing all the time. There's periods of silence and intervals of non-music that actually accentuate, punctuate, and and give meaning to the overall music. And those periods are actually quite necessary and wouldn't make sense if they were lost. So yeah, I think cramming too much is not a good idea, and I struggle with that. But I do want to kind of also pick up on the idea of what constitutes a life well lived. And there are ways in which some of the more profound experiences that we have kind of come unexpected. They come from moments that we're not trying to be productive or trying to force a thing. Um, and so this also introduces this element of control, right? Which seems inevitable. Part of what is interesting about the of waiting is that you don't have control over something, because if you did, you wouldn't actually be waiting, right? When you're waiting for something, there's an expectation of, to your point, something to take place. You're expecting something to happen, whether it's a train to arrive, a person to come, an insight to take place, um, and it's out of your control. You want the thing to happen right now, but you can't. And so I do believe the idea of active versus passive plays some role in that. Um, and how much, how out of control you are about the expectation that you have may dictate the level or the degree of active or passive waiting that you're doing. But I think it also kind of connects to meaning, um, and control. Being able to control something is important, at least for me, because it's a way of directing and ensuring a security around certain things happening the way that you want them to. So there's a lot there, but I do fundamentally think that you're right to point out the tension, and that there is. It's not easy. It's not an easy balance how to regulate and manage that tension, because there are times where you probably want to take more agency in the thing that you're waiting for. And there's other times where taking more agency is actually counterproductive. So I'm interested to hear how you think about that point, agency with respect to waiting, as well as the idea of control. Processing. All right, and I'm going to go back. All right, let's hear what Claude has to say.
I love these points that you raise, so there's a lot here that I kind of want to get into. I agree with you about the point that you said about let's examine what productive act.
Whoops. That was the wrong stuff. I needed to put that into Claude. Yeah, there we go. Okay, now I'm gonna get a response back, and then It's a good one. There we go.
You touched on something crucial here. The relationship between control and meaning, and how waiting forces us into a space where we must grapple with the limits of our agency. Let me walk through this systematically, because I think understanding this tension is key to understanding what waiting actually teaches us about being human. First, let's establish what's happening when we wait. You're absolutely right that waiting only exists when control is absent. If I could make the train arrive immediately, I wouldn't be waiting, I'd be acting. Waiting is fundamentally an encounter with the boundaries of our will. This creates what we might call a control paradox. The more urgently we want something, the more acutely we feel our powerlessness over it. Now, here's where your insight about agency becomes really interesting. Even within the constraints of waiting, we retain different degrees of agency over how we inhabit that space. Think of it as operating on multiple levels simultaneously. At the macro level, whether the train comes or not, we have no control. But at the micro level, how we direct our attention, what meaning we make of the experience, how we position our body and mind, we retain considerable agency. This suggests that the active versus passive distinction in waiting isn't really binary. Instead, waiting might be better understood as an exercise in what philosophers call negative capability, the ability to remain present and engage with uncertainty without rushing toward premature resolution. The poet John Keats described this as being capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Let me give you a concrete example to illustrate how this works. Imagine you're waiting for potentially life-changing medical test results. You cannot control when they arrive or what they say. That's the macro level where you're genuinely powerless. But you could choose whether to spend that waiting time in anxious speculation, in distraction, or in what we might call present moment receptivity, staying open to whatever emerges without trying to force a particular outcome. Here's what I find fascinating about your observation on security and control. Our desire to control outcomes often stems from a deeper need for predictability and safety.
Yes,
But
exactly.
waiting regularly confronts us with the reality that much of life is fundamentally unpredictable. This creates an interesting pedagogical function. Waiting might actually be training us in a crucial life skill, which is learning to find stability and meaning not in controlling outcomes, but in developing our capacity to respond skillfully to whatever arises.
Fascinating.
This connects to your earlier point about profound experiences often coming unexpectedly. There seems to be something about the receptive, non-controlling state that waiting can cultivate that actually creates conditions for insight, connection, or creative breakthrough. It's as if our constant attempts to manage and direct experience sometimes crowd out the very experiences we most value. Think about falling in love, for instance. You can put yourself in situations where love might arise, but you cannot manufacture the experience itself. The following happens in a space that's neither purely active nor purely passive. You're present, open, engaged, but not grasping or forcing. So perhaps the key question becomes, how do we learn to exercise agency within surrender? How do we remain actively engaged with life while accepting that many of the most important things, love, creativity, healing, understanding, emerge from processes we cannot directly control? What's your experience been with this balance? Have you noticed times when trying to control an outcome actually interfered with achieving it, or conversely, when letting go of control created space for something better to emerge?
Super interesting. Super interesting. I love all of these points that are kind of coming up. Um, I found it actually quite interesting when you said there seems to be something about the receptive, non controlling state that waiting can cultivate that actually creates conditions for insight, connection, or creative breakthrough. I hadn't thought about it like that. I think that's a fascinating perspective that waiting is actually teaching you a lesson about the way life works. And I completely agree. The 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 sentence that you have here, waiting regularly confronts us with the reality that much of life is fundamentally unpredictable. And waiting is in itself an act of enduring and wading through that very unpredictability. It's something that is confronting you very much in your face, and sounds to be more profound than we probably give it credit for. At least that was an interesting insight for me to learn. I think it's also fascinating. I did want to kind of come back to this point about um, waiting isn't really binary. There is a an aspect where the you mentioned the macro level and the micro level, and I think the interesting thing really is the micro level, because at the macro level there's no trial, there's no control. That's whether the train comes on time or not, and we have no control over that. So at the micro level, what we do have control over is what we do within the space of waiting. And we don't know how long that space is going to be. And we have choices to make while we're in that space. So uh, I could I could choose to be upset. I could choose to be irritated. I could choose to be uh, calm and peaceful. I could choose to remind myself that this is something that I don't have any control of, and therefore I am going to use this, something that I can think about now, as a way to practice being in that space of unpredictability and of no control, right? So that is fascinating. Um, and yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that we have considerable agency, but the truth is we often don't feel that way. I think that's an interesting part or interesting aspect, is that while people are often sitting in the space of waiting, there doesn't appear to be as much agency as we really have. And that seems to be from an emotional tension, because we're more focused on the thing that we want to happen rather than the thing that is happening right now. Uh, so yeah, I think a need a deep need for predictability and safety is true, and that waiting can give us preparation and teach us about how to manage when that's not true. Do I have experience with this balance? I'm sure I do. I think it is. I'm kind of in that space right now, in the sense that I have a knee injury, an ACL injury, that has a fixed timeline in which to heal, and I don't have any way to really control that. And so it's limiting what I can do and where I can go and how I can act in various ways. And yeah, that is frustrating. But I think, your points are things that I definitely will think about a little bit more. Almost there. Okay. Let's see. Here's what Claude has to say.
Your personal example of the ACL injury illuminates something profound about the deeper layers of what we've been discussing. Here you are, confronting a very concrete form of waiting, your body's healing timeline, and experiencing firsthand that tension between what you can and cannot control. This is actually a perfect case study for understanding how waiting functions as a teacher. Let me build on your insight about emotional tension and our focus being misdirected. When you say people don't feel they have much agency because they're more focused on the thing that we want to happen, rather than the thing that is happening right now, you've identified what might be the core psychological challenge of waiting. Our attention becomes fixated on the absent future outcome, which renders us blind to the present moment where our actual power resides. Think about it this way. Your ACL is healing according to biological processes that operate on their own timeline, completely independent of your desires or frustrations. At the macro level, you're absolutely powerless over cellular repair, tissue regeneration, and the fundamental mechanics of healing. But at the micro level, moment by moment, day by day, you have enormous agency over how you relate to this process. Consider the mental framework you could develop around this injury. You could view it purely as an interruption, something stealing time from your real life. Or you could approach it as an unexpected curriculum in patience, in learning to find meaning and engagement within constraints you didn't choose. The injury itself remains exactly the same, but the experience of living with it transforms completely based on how you frame your relationship to the waiting it requires. This connects to something fascinating about human consciousness that waiting reveals. We have this remarkable capacity to live simultaneously in multiple temporal dimensions. Part of your mind is naturally oriented toward the future moment when your knee will be fully healed, but another part could be fully present to what's available right now. Perhaps deeper conversations like this one, or forms of reflection and learning that your usual active lifestyle might not have afforded. Here's a thinking exercise that might illuminate this further. Imagine for a moment that the healing process could somehow be accelerated to complete instantly, but with the condition that you would lose all the insights, patience, or inner development that the waiting period might offer. Would that be an obviously superior outcome? This isn't to romanticize injury or suggest that suffering is inherently valuable, but rather to explore whether the enforced pause might contain its own forms of growth and understanding. The Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron writes about something called staying with the experience, which seems directly relevant to your situation. She suggests that our habitual response to discomfort, whether physical limitation or emotional frustration, is to mentally flee towards some imagined future resolution. But the actual learning happens when we can remain present with what's unfolding, including the difficulty of it. Your observation about feeling frustrated makes complete sense and doesn't need to be eliminated or judged. Frustration is simply part of the honest human response to limitation. The question becomes, can you hold both the frustration and the curiosity about what this experience might be teaching you? Can you be irritated about the constraints while simultaneously exploring how to inhabit them with some degree of grace? This brings us back to that earlier point about the receptive, not controlling state creating conditions for breakthrough. Sometimes our most profound insights about resilience, about what really matters to us, about the difference between what we can and cannot influence, emerge precisely during these periods of enforced waiting. The injury becomes not just something to endure until normal life resumes, but a unique window into aspects of existence that our usual busyness might obscure. What do you notice about your relationship to time itself during this healing period? Has the enforced slowing down revealed anything about how you typically move through your days, or about what kinds of activities and relationships feel most essential versus merely habitual?
Yeah, some great stuff here. I've noticed a lot of things, and honestly, it has come at a really interesting time. Um, yeah, and there's so much to say. I mean, what have I learned, or what have I noticed about my relationship to time during this healing period? Honestly, I have been frustrated. The frustration has been difficult, but I think what is also true is it has made me think about, well, what can I do? What is possible? I don't I know I can't do this, but I can do that. So I'm going to try to do that as much as I can while still being careful not to re-injure myself and have to start this whole process all over again from the very beginning. Um, so yeah, there are lessons to be learned, but I worry that I'm not learning them. I do worry that there isn't deeper insights that I'm actually gaining. I think it is uh, partly wishful thinking that something good is just going to kind of come out of this, and it is kind of maybe an exercise in hope as well. You just kind of have to hope that there's you walk away from this experience with more than just enduring. But maybe not. I think that could also be true. um, I have read Pema Chodron before, and I think it is the point about the habitual response is to mentally flee towards some imagined future. Um, and then the actual learning is taking place in what's happening right now, including the difficulty of it. I guess where I get lost is like, well, what do you do with that? I can be present with the experience and present with the frustration and present with um, both knowing what I can do and what I cannot do. um, but then it feels flat to me, or dishonest to say that there's a deeper insight there. I think it just is, and I don't feel more than that. Uh, I have been very curious though, and I have definitely realized that my previous life before this quote unquote interruption was very much kind of going on autopilot, and I was locked into specific habits and behavior patterns that the injury forced me out of, and to be able to look at and to examine independently of being inside of them. And of course, once my knee does heal and get better, I have a choice to make whether or not to return and quote unquote reinsert myself into those same behavior patterns. I don't think I want to, but I mean they're not all terrible, but I do see that there's an opportunity cost to that, and I think that is has been an interesting and important part of this learning experience. And yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, and whether or not I am missing more or less. Or I think the other thing is that there is a little bit of a romance with this receptive, non-controlling state magically manifesting this profound experience and insights, and something is just gonna happen that is gonna make me think and realize and reflect back that this was such an important and amazing thing. I'm not so sure. I don't know, and I think there is uh, a little bit of a danger in making that kind of an assumption. And so I want to push back on that, and I also want to get your opinion on my response in that respect. Well, it was a long answer, but let's see what it says. Go where it goes, see where it sees. It's starting to rain pretty heavily outside. Almost there. There's some thunder. Okay. Okay, here we go. That's pretty cool. Okay. Let's hear Claude's perspective.
Your pushback is not just valid, it's essential. You've identified something crucial that I think gets lost in a lot of spiritual or philosophical discourse about suffering and limitation. The difference between genuine insight and what we might call meaning-making as consolation prize. Let me work through why your skepticism here is actually a sign of intellectual honesty rather than missing something important. First, let's examine this romance with the receptive non-controlling state that you've called out. There is indeed a kind of magical thinking that creeps into discussions about rating and limitation. This assumption that if we just approach difficulty with the right mindset, it will automatically transform into profound wisdom.
Yeah.
This is problematic for several reasons. It can minimize genuine loss and frustration, create pressure to find silver linings where none exist, and most importantly, it can distract us from the more mundane but potentially more valuable forms of learning that might actually be happening. Think about what you've already described, noticing. You mentioned being forced out of autopilot patterns and being able to examine your previous behavior patterns from outside of them. This is actually quite significant, but notice how different it is from some mystical breakthrough moment. You're not describing a flash of enlightenment. You're describing a shift in perspective that allows you to see the opportunity costs of your habitual ways of living. This kind of clear-eyed assessment of your own patterns is valuable precisely because it's practical and actionable rather than ethereal. Your observation that, I think it just is, when you're presented with the frustration and limitation strikes me as more honest than searching for hidden meanings. Sometimes the value of staying present with difficulty isn't that it reveals secret wisdom, but simply that it prevents us from compounding our suffering through mental escape or resistance. The frustration of a healing ACL is already uncomfortable enough without adding layers of self-judgment about not healing fast enough, or guilt about being frustrated, or pressure to extract profound lessons from the experience. Let me offer a different framework for thinking about what learning might look like in your situation. Instead of looking for dramatic insights, consider that you might be developing what we could call practical wisdom about constraint. You're learning firsthand how to navigate the gap between what you want and what's possible. You're discovering which activities and relationships feel most essential when your options are limited. You're experiencing how habits can become invisible until something forces you to examine them. These are all forms of learning, but they're grounded in practical rather than transcendent. This connects to a broader philosophical point about the relationship between experience and wisdom. The assumption that difficult experiences automatically generate insight is actually backwards. Experiences, even profound ones, are just raw material. Learning happens through reflection, analysis, and integration, and sometimes the most valuable learning is simply recognizing what is true rather than what we wish were true. You are concerned about whether you will reinsert yourself into old patterns once you heal reveals something important. The injury has created a natural experiment in your life. You've been forced to live differently, and now you can observe the results. Some patterns you might discover were more valuable than you realized. Others you might find you don't miss at all. The key insight here isn't necessarily that your old life was wrong, but rather that you now have more conscious choice about how to structure your time and energy. Here's a thinking exercise that might help clarify this. Instead of asking, what profound insights am I supposed to be gaining? Try asking, what am I learning about my own preferences, priorities, and capabilities under constraint? The second question is more specific and observable. It doesn't require mystical breakthrough, just honest self-observation. Your worry that you're not worthy enough suggests you might be holding yourself to an impossible standard. Consider that simply enduring difficulty with reasonable grace, maintaining curiosity about your own responses, and staying open to practical adjustments in how you live. These might be exactly the right forms of learning for your situation. Not every challenging experience needs to be transformative in dramatic ways. Sometimes the value is more subtle: increased self-knowledge, greater appreciation for what you normally take for granted, or simply prove to yourself that you can handle unexpected limitations. What do you think about reframing the question from "what deep insights should I be gaining" to "what am I noticing about how I respond to constraint, and what might that tell me about how I want to live when I have more options again"? Does that feel more honest to your actual experience?
It does feel more honest. I think where I know I am getting hung up is that a significant experience like this makes me feel like there should be a significant gain from it. And if the gain isn't significant, then it does, I go back to the place where, oh, that I mostly wasted my time. I just, all during the healing process, I was just, twiddling my thumbs and not really kind of going anywhere. And where I tried to go, I just couldn't get to. So yeah, I know that is, you're right. There is a pressure I'm placing on myself, um, is an impossible standard. And even though I am the one actually calling out uh, the part that there isn't a requirement for this transformative, dramatic learning to take place, it is actually something that I feel like I'm placing on myself, but it's not. It's unfair. It's understandably unfair. Um, but I do think that those are helpful things. The what am I learning about my own preferences, priorities, and capabilities under constraint? I mean, I've been in a situation like this or situations like this before, and I feel like that's those have helped me to kind of cope and be with this experience now. So the idea of recognizing, okay, well, I can't do this. Well, then what can I do? And then going out and then doing that is important, um, and has been helpful. I mean, it hasn't been all that bad. I'm 5 months post surgery. And so, it's getting closer and closer. I'm able to do more and more. And so that's allowing me to kind of have a more robust experience of life and feeling like I'm getting more and more normal. But there's still constraints. There's still things that I can't do. And I am constantly reminded of that. And it saddens me that I can't do all the things that I want to do. Um, and yeah, I know that isn't a lesson in and of itself, right? Just being with and not trying to mentally escape. I don't, I've definitely done that. I've definitely looked to a future where I'm able to kind of go back to normal, and like, what am I going to do then? Am I going to just jump back into the same routines like I was mentioning before, or make some different choices? And I feel like I have this time to think about that and to sort through that, and I'm trying to. And I think the challenge is that I don't know that I'm getting closer. I think what's also challenging for me in these moments is, uh, you know, you don't know what it's hard to see what like progress looks like. That's another learning for sure, where progress, sometimes is going forwards and backwards. There's a fluctuation there. It's not a straight line. It's not predictable, going back to what we were talking about before around control and predictability. So all of those things are kind of in the mix as well. And so, yeah, I'm interested to kind of hear your take on that also. Let's see what Claude says. I don't think anybody is. That boy's cooking. Nice. Yeah, I have him on explanatory mode. Oops. Let's do Eric. All right, here we go. Now I'm going to feed this over to Claude. Wait a minute. Did I? Okay. He's almost there. This is way, like I said, this is way more interesting than anything GPT-5 could cook up. All right, let's see what Claude has to say.
You just articulated something that goes to the heart of how we assign value to our experiences, and I think this deserves careful examination because it reveals some fundamental assumptions about how learning and growth actually work. Let's start by unpacking this equation you constructed. Significant experience should equal significant gain, and if the gain isn't significant, then the time was wasted.
Right.
This formula seems logical on the surface, but let me walk you through why it might be creating unnecessary suffering and actually obscuring the real learning that's happening. First, consider how we typically measure significance in learning or personal growth. We tend to look for dramatic before and after comparisons, clear moments of revelation, or major behavioral changes that we can point to as evidence of transformation. But this framework borrowed from dramatic narratives doesn't match how most genuine learning actually occurs. Think about how you learned to read as a child. There wasn't a single moment where you suddenly could read. It was thousands of small recognitions, countless encounters with letters and sounds, gradual building of pattern recognition. Most of the process felt ordinary while it was happening. You weren't sitting there thinking, I'm having a significant learning experience right now, as you sounded out individual words. Yet the cumulative result was profound. You gained access to written language, which fundamentally changed your relationship to knowledge and communication.
Fair point.
Now let's apply this understanding to your injury experience. You mentioned noticing that your pre-injury life had autopilot patterns that you can now examine from outside. This might seem like a small observation, but consider its implications. How many people go through their entire lives without ever having this kind of perspective on their own habitual behaviors? How many people remain unconscious of their patterns until much later in life, when changing them becomes more difficult? The fact that you can now see the opportunity costs of certain behaviors isn't a minor insight. It's a form of self-knowledge that many people struggle to develop even through years of therapy or reflection. You've been given a natural experiment in living differently, and you're gathering data about your own preferences and priorities under constraint. This is practical wisdom developing in real time, even if it doesn't feel dramatic. Let me offer you a different lens for understanding what constitutes valuable learning. Instead of looking for transformation, consider that you might be developing what educators call metacognition, thinking about your own thinking, awareness of your own awareness. When you notice your frustration with the healing timeline, when you observe your tendency to place impossible standards on yourself, when you recognize the difference between what you can and cannot control, these are all examples of metacognitive development. This type of learning is often invisible while it's happening because it doesn't create external changes you can easily measure, but it builds the foundation for more conscious choice making in the future. When your knee heals and you face decisions about which patterns to resume, you will be making those choices from a more informed position than you had before the injury. That increased awareness has value regardless of what specific choices you make. Here's a thinking exercise that might help clarify this. Imagine meeting yourself from 6 months ago, before the injury happened. What would you be able to explain to that previous version of yourself about living with constraint, about the hidden costs of certain habits, about what activities and relationships feel most essential when options are limited? Even if these insights feel ordinary to you now, they represent knowledge that your past self didn't possess. Now, let's address the emotional dimension of your concern about wasting time. The feeling that significant experiences should yield proportional gains often stems from what psychologists call loss aversion. We feel losses more acutely than equivalent gains.
Hmm.
The injury represents a clear loss of mobility, activities, and time. Your mind naturally wants to balance this ledger by finding equivalent gains in wisdom or growth. But
Interesting.
here's what's important to understand. The value of an experience doesn't have to be proportional to its difficulty or duration to be worthwhile. Sometimes the most valuable learning is simply discovering that you can endure uncertainty and limitation with reasonable grace. Sometimes it's learning to distinguish between productive and unproductive forms of self-pressure. Sometimes it's developing a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between control and acceptance. Consider this reframe. Instead of asking whether the gains from this experience are significant enough to justify the time spent, ask yourself what you learned about your own capacity to navigate unwanted circumstances. What have you discovered about which sources of meaning and engagement remain available even when your preferred activities are restricted? What has this experience taught you about the difference between patience and resignation, or between acceptance and giving up? These questions point toward forms of learning that are practical and applicable to many future situations. Life will present you with other constraints, other periods of waiting, other gaps between what you want and what's possible. The skills you're developing now, how to maintain curiosity during limitation, how to find agency within constraint, how to distinguish between reasonable and unreasonable self-expectations. These will serve you regardless of the specific circumstances. Think about it this way. You're not just healing from an ACL injury. You're also learning how to heal from an ACL injury, which includes learning how to relate to the healing process itself. This meta-level learning about how to navigate enforced patience and limitation is transferable to other areas of life where you might face constraints you didn't choose. What strikes me as most valuable in what you've shared is your capacity for honest self-reflection even when it reveals uncomfortable truths about your own expectations and pressures. This kind of clear-eyed self-awareness, this ability to notice and question your own mental patterns, represents a form of practical wisdom that many people struggle to develop. The fact that you can simultaneously hold frustration about your situation while also examining that frustration with curiosity suggests that significant learning is already happening, even if it doesn't match your expectations for what significant learning should
Look
look like.
like.
What would it feel like to consider that your honest engagement with this experience, including your frustration, your questioning, your resistance to false consolation, might itself be a form of successful learning, rather than evidence that you're missing something more important?
Hmm. Super interesting. What would it feel like to consider? Um, well, it feels helpful, but again, it doesn't feel like enough. and, that, and that's, again, I'm being honest, but I do feel like I liked that point. I mean, I think that's very true. The part about the ledger. So this injury represents a clear loss of mobility, activities, and time. And my mind is definitely trying to find a way to balance that. And it can't, uh, because it's just not true. The learnings that I believe that I'm getting from this experience again, this is a choice that I'm making, but the value that I'm placing on those lessons doesn't offset the the situation, the part about what the experience that I'm going through entails. So there's definitely a tension there, and it's definitely one that I am more in control of. And I do feel like that's a lot of that is self-imposed, but it's also learned. I think there is definitely a societal suggestion that this is how it ought to be. You should get something out of in an equivalent fashion from whatever is the thing that you're going to. But I do take all these points. I think that the being able to hold a frustration and examine it, and then just being having curiosity about what I can do, and then going out and just doing that, and recognizing this mismatch and my expectation about what I should be learning and what I think I actually am learning is fair. And so, yeah, I don't want to keep going in circles, but yeah, I mean, there are still things that I feel are lacking or missing, and yeah, I don't think we need to go too more deeply. I actually kind of have to wrap it up, but I do want to give you like a quick response, or a quick wrap up, so that we can kind of call it. All right, let's see what it says. Okay, almost there. All right, I'm gonna pop this in. All right, here we go. And I'm gonna actually have to go. Let's see how long this is. Hopefully not. Okay, good. It's not that long. So here we go. All right, this will be the last part.
Your honesty about this tension, acknowledging the helpfulness of reframing while still feeling like it's not enough, actually points to something profound about the nature of genuine acceptance versus intellectual understanding.
Yeah.
What you're describing is the gap between knowing something cognitively and feeling it emotionally.
100%.
You can intellectually recognize that your expectations might be unreasonable, that societal messages about equivalent exchange don't match how real learning works, that you're developing valuable forms of self-awareness, and simultaneously feel that none of this adequately compensates for what you've lost. Both of these can be true at the same time, and the tension between them doesn't need to be resolved. This might be one of those situations where the learning isn't about reaching a satisfying conclusion or finding the perfect balance, but rather about developing comfort with the resolution itself.
Yeah.
Perhaps part of what this experience is teaching you is how to hold multiple contradictory feelings and perspectives simultaneously: frustration and curiosity, loss and growth, intellectual understanding and emotional resistance. The fact that you can articulate this tension so clearly, that you can see both your own self-imposed pressures and their cultural origins, suggests you're developing exactly the kind of nuanced self-awareness that will serve you well beyond this particular injury. You are learning to observe your own mind in real time, to notice when your expectations create unnecessary suffering, and to maintain intellectual honesty even when it doesn't provide emotional relief. Sometimes the most valuable learning from difficult experiences isn't dramatic transformation or profound insight, but simply a more sophisticated understanding of how you respond to circumstances beyond your control. That capacity for clear-eyed self-observation, especially during frustrating times, is a form of practical wisdom that will be useful in countless future situations involving constraint, uncertainty, or unmet expectations. The experience doesn't have to feel sufficient or transformative to be valuable. Sometimes learning is simply developing a more realistic relationship with your own expectations about learning.
Nice. And that's it. We're gonna cut it. That was actually a good session. I liked it. I think I learned a lot from it, and hopefully other people did too. Um, All right. Well, thanks. Thanks, Eric, for joining. That was cool. I'll see you then.